was this? Okay, well, we just got new stuff.
Yeah, wood was stained like a white oak.
Yeah, well, that's what.
The walls were
I really felt like it was
Yeah.
Good evening. Why don't we get started? My name is Naomi Yavnaklos, and I'm the Reverend Emmett Bienvenu, S.J., Distinguished Chair in Humanities and a Professor of Languages and Cultures. So on behalf of the Department of Languages and Cultures, the College of Arts and Sciences, Loyola University, the National Council of Jewish Women, many of whom, my grandson, joining us over live stream, the the Grant Center for American Jewish Studies at Tulane University, and Touro Synagogue and Temple Sinai, who all graciously agreed to co-sponsor this event and help us to publicize it. I'd like to thank you so much for being here this evening for this wonderful, I think will be fascinating lecture by Dr. Patricia Hall of the University of Michigan. As you may know, last Monday was International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and that day marked 80 years since the liberation of Auschwitz. It's important to remember, right, that 6 million Jewish people and 5 million non-Jewish people, Roma Sinti people, disabled people, other marginalized groups were murdered during the Holocaust, and that the survivors, right, 90% of people were murdered upon arrival at Auschwitz. So I think it's really important for us to think about the fact that in these terrible conditions, right, under unimaginable circumstances, in part coerced, but in part through their own will, people were able somehow to continue to make music. And we hope to find resilience and strength in that. So we're really excited to hear what Dr. Hall will tell us this evening. To put us in a mood of reflection, this evening we'll start with the Jewish Hashkivenu prayer, which is a prayer that invites the Eternal to spread over us a shelter of peace. And so I invite Shoshana Yavna-Borva, class of 2013, to perform that for us. Thank you so much, Shoshana. Now we turn to our talk. by Dr. Patricia Hall, who is Professor Emeritus of Music Theory at the University of Michigan. She studied at the University of California, Berkeley, go Bears, and also at Columbia and Yale. And she is the author of A View of Berg's Life, Berg's Lulu, through the autograph sources, and this book was the winner of the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award. She also wrote a book, Berg's Wozzeck, and she was co-editor with Friedman Salas of a handbook to 20th century musical sketches and general editor of the Oxford Handbook of Music Censorship. So she has a very rich background in musicology, exploring all sorts of interesting musical works of the 20th century before turning to this scholarship of music from Auschwitz and Birkenau. She also founded the online journal Music and Politics, and she was editor of that journal from 2007 to 2017 and served as the president of the Society for Music Theory from 2019 through 2021. She has been researching manuscripts at the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum in Poland for the last 8 years and was recently interviewed on the PBS NewsHour. Performances of the music from Auschwitz manuscripts took place in January 2025 for International Holocaust Remembrance Day at Wigmore Hall in London, also at the Music of Remembrance in Seattle, and at the Auschwitz Memorial in Poland. So I think we're ready for a really inspiring talk, and thank you so much for joining us here at Loyola.
Thank you so much for your introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today. While many Holocaust survivors have given vivid accounts of the music they heard in Auschwitz, even supplying titles, we really don't know what this music sounded like. There are photographs and drawings of a few of the ensembles that played in the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex, but no recordings were ever made. In this presentation, I explain the process I used in reconstructing music played in Auschwitz from manuscript parts preserved in the collections department at the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. These parts were dance band arrangements created by Polish political prisoners from Auschwitz I and performed at Sunday concerts for the SS. We'll listen to performances of these reconstructions and see how they've been adapted in recent soundtracks like Barry Levinson's The Survivor and Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest. Finally, and most importantly, how can these reconstructions educate audiences and performers about the music of Auschwitz, the musicians who performed it, and by extension, the Holocaust? I'll describe the recent concerts of our University of Michigan student ensemble in Vienna and Poland, as well as concerts by other youth ensembles that took place during International Holocaust Remembrance Day. The primary function of music ensembles in Auschwitz I was to play marches near the Arbeit macht frei gate in the morning as prisoners left for outside work details, and in the evening when they returned to the camp. Prisoners were beaten if they did not march exactly in time to the music. The horrible scenes as exhausted prisoners returned home from work at the end of the day, and the distress of the musicians who witnessed them are frequently described in testimonies. The prisoners left for work in rows of 5 abreast, which made it easier to count them. The SS men counted out loud 5, 10, 15, 20, 100, and noted it all down. When the squads returned from work, they were much smaller. Often 30 or 40 corpses were carried into the camp. It was a horrible scene. I thought I could meet the same fate at any time, but I had to play. Augustin Bartuszczyk, prisoner number 45091. From this initial ensemble, other musical ensembles began to develop in Auschwitz I, including an 80-member orchestra and a dance band, the subject of my talk today. My path to researching the music of the dance band began with a visit in 2016 to the collections department of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. I was intrigued by a description I had read by Shimon Laks, one of the former conductors of the Birkenau Men's Orchestra, in which he described himself as a musical gravedigger. By this, he meant that he had been forced to use an unusual notation called Odeon that allowed him to include the main themes in all the parts because of the very real possibility that one of the band members would die and someone else would have to take over his part with another instrument. When I inquired whether there were manuscripts in the collections department, I was informed that only 5% of the documents from Auschwitz had survived, and that I might find pencil annotations on printed scores. Given this advice, I was not hopeful about finding manuscripts and expected to spend most of my day simply visiting the memorial. After taking a night train from Vienna, I made my way to the collections department, which was housed in Block 25 of the former Auschwitz I camp. The staff of the collections department set up workstations for me, first in the break room and later in the hallway. I found myself often staring at the wear patterns of the original flooring, which had been retained from the time this building housed Auschwitz prisoners. As a researcher of manuscripts, I am used to working with very personal documents such as diaries, intimate letters, and medical records. What I had never encountered, however, was the painful irony of many of the song titles in the context of a concentration camp. Some examples include Letters That Never Arrived, Hours That One Can Never Forget, or Sing a Song When You're Sad. Although I had only 2 days to work through the entire card catalog, I frequently had to stop my work to mentally process this profound experience. I was also astonished at the wealth of primary documents in the archive. There were hundreds of pages of manuscript parts for hit tunes from the late 30s and early 40s, arranged by the prisoners for the unique instrumentation of their dance band. They were neatly written in ink, often on a brand of music paper called Beethoven Papier, or Beethoven paper. Some of these manuscript parts even bore the prisoner number of the arranger and copyist, which allowed me to learn his name through the prisoner database. And here you see another example where the handwriting looks extremely different than the previous one because it's done by a different arranger copyist. And here's the second page of that. This part, for instance, is signed with the number 5131, which I've circled, which belongs to Maximilian Piwat, who arrived in the camp on September 22nd, 1940. Like many of his Polish colleagues in the orchestra, he was transferred to a concentration camp in Germany in October 1944. We do not have a prisoner photograph of Piwat, but fortunately the artist and fellow prisoner Stefan Andrzejewski created a portrait of him in 1944. Piwat was a bassoonist and graduate of the Warsaw Conservatory. He also played clarinet and oboe, After the war, he played in the Breslau Orchestra and beginning in 1953 in the orchestra of the State Opera and Baltic Philharmonic in Gdansk. How did prisoners obtain the published music from which they arranged these hit tunes? Here is a prisoner photograph of 18-year-old Jerzy Gominski. Jerzy and his mother worked for a Polish partisan group and allowed endangered individuals to stay in their pension near Warsaw. Jerzy was sent to Auschwitz on March 6, 1942, and executed by shooting on August 14, 1942. While being a member of the Auschwitz I Orchestra saved many prisoners from immediate death in brutal work details, it also made them vulnerable by being in such an exposed setting. Maximilian Pilat commented, "The worst was when Palich appeared, when we were playing. Then it's obvious he's going to take someone out of the orchestra and lead him to Block 11. As far as I remember, he took out around 50 people from the orchestra and shot them personally." And the SS officer they're referring to, Palich, is appearing in this slide here. He was a roll call leader. In Jerzy's letter to his sister, written on June 26, 1942, he demonstrates an extraordinary knowledge of classical music, listing 10 titles of operas, symphonic literature, and other works that he would like his sister to send him. In addition to 50 sheets of music paper, he asks her to send some of the latest hits, music for the latest hits, using the address of the orchestra. During my first visit to the museum in 2016, I was immediately drawn to the piece Die schönste Zeit des Lebens, which is the most beautiful time of life, not because of its musical properties, but because it had the most ironic title I could imagine for a piece coming out of a death camp. It's based on a song by Franz Grota, a film composer, and its original text is about falling in love in the month of May. It immediately became a mission for me to make a recording of this piece so that the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum would have an accurate demonstration of one of the ensembles at Auschwitz. Around this time, I was also introduced to Oriol Sanz, the then conductor of the Contemporary Directions Ensemble at U of M, and now director of orchestral activities and assistant professor of conducting at the University of Wisconsin. Oriol became my musical partner in this endeavor, giving voice to my research. He suggested that the Contemporary Directions Ensemble, and these were mostly graduate students, should play Die schönste Zeit as the opening piece in their fall 2018 concert. My first reaction was that a piece entitled The Most Beautiful Time of Life and coming out of a death camp might be painful for audiences. And they would also find the orchestration odd. I forgot that these pieces were created for audiences, albeit very select ones, of SS and concentration camp prisoners. I also couldn't anticipate the expertise of the Auschwitz arrangers, who were able to create something quite beautiful with such extreme limitations. So I'm going to play for you now this very short piece. I'll play the whole thing. It's less than 4 minutes long. Die schönste Zeit des Lebens, or the most beautiful time of life. And this is a performance by members of the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra.
As a result of a recording of Die Schönste made by U of M students, this little piece, less than 4 minutes long, went very quickly from mute for over 70 years to being broadcast on NPR, the BBC, Le Monde, the PBS NewsHour, and other news programs. An Associated Press article appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and 1,100 other news media in 22 countries. People called my office and emailed me, asking me to go back to the archive to find more pieces so that I could construct an entire program. I thought about it for a few months and then decided to continue this research. I returned to the collections department, fortunately, before COVID hit, and found 9 other pieces that would have enough variety, but also continuity to make a coherent program. By this time, I was very familiar with the typical orchestration used by the dance band. 8 violins, 2 violas, 2 clarinets, a trombone, a tuba, and in some pieces, 3 saxophones. Some of the pieces featured male quartets or duets. When a manuscript was obviously missing, I located the published equivalent from databases of used sheet music or in other archives. This is a more difficult task than it appears. While these pieces were hits or Schlager in the late 30s or early 40s, published versions of this music are often extremely difficult to locate. Some are found in used sheet music stores in Germany, whose contents are often digitized. Occasionally, they can be found in German libraries or private collections and archives. The published score and parts for the Foxtrot Jeden Abend, which we'll be talking about next, by Billy Bartholomew, resides in exactly 1 library in the world, the Staatsbibliothek of Berlin. The only location for the parts for Die Schönste Zeit des Lebens we just heard is the private Franz Grothe archive in Berlin. Seeing the published version of a piece, oops, sorry, I have to get away from that. Seeing the published version of a piece performed in Auschwitz also highlighted how unique the Auschwitz arrangements were beyond their unusual orchestration. I've been puzzled by manuscripts like this one
in which the Auschwitz arrangers wrote the notes for a male quartet with the melodic line in ink transiting among the various voices. When I finally located the printed score for this piece in Berlin last May, I expected to also see printed parts for the entire quartet. Instead, I found only one part, the melodic line. The Auschwitz arrangers created the other three parts because they had an established male quartet. And this happened in other pieces as well. Here is the prisoner photo for Adam Wysowski and an earlier photo from 1933. He performed in and led male quartets in Auschwitz I. So that's his prisoner photograph, Adam Wysowski, and that's before the war. Wysowski was also a violinist and pianist who performed before the war in dance bands in the Dana Vocal Quartet. Here is a short excerpt of his voice. All right, you'll hear about 15 minutes of an introduction, and then his voice is going to come in.
Eurydyko, co ty masz tam pod tuniką? Ach, powiedz słówko, Eurydyko, o to jedno nęci mnie. Czy tunika, czy też kiecka, ale zawsze starogrecka. Eurydyko, pragnę dziko, bez tuniki ujrzeć cię.
And next, I'm going to play the realization of that quartet that you saw the manuscript for, so you can hear what that sounded like as composed and arranged by the Auschwitz prisoners. So this is our ensemble, and you'll hear a male quartet singing.
Ich geh jeden Abend dicht an deine Tür vorbei, kenn die Straße eine lang, doch dich hab ich noch nie gesehen. So zeigt jeden Abend Himmel nur das gleiche Bild. Dort auf einem kleinen Schild steht Fräulein Magdalene. Wo magst du nur ein, bist auch du allein. Bitte komm doch bitte, ich will so gerne deinen Schritt. Drum geh jeden Abend ich an deine Tür vorbei. Geh am Schlüsselplatz zurück, vielleicht hab ich noch Glück.
I was grateful to be completing this project in a university environment where the challenges or questions that arose could easily be resolved by my talented and creative colleagues. For instance, what is this weird harmony and what is it doing? And you'll see that circle there. Could the arrangers have made a mistake? And just so you can hear what this sounds like. All of us, including our conductor, were perplexed until I showed it to Ellen Rowe, professor of jazz and contemporary improvisation, who took one look at it and said, "Oh yeah, they did that all the time in 30s jazz bands." It would not be an exaggeration to say that every note of these arrangements was examined First, to make sure that it had been transcribed correctly from the manuscript, and secondly, that they sounded like viable choices when performed. When I showed my collection of 10 waltzes, tangos, and foxtrots to my colleague Eugene Rogers, director of university choirs, his first comment was, "You need some context." That immediately gave me the idea of inserting lines from testimonies of members of the Auschwitz I Men's Orchestra. These testimonies are arranged chronologically from the initial beginnings of the ensemble in 1940 to its dissolution in 1945, January 1945. Each testimony introduces the piece that follows it. Some testimony lines are quite graphic. For instance, this description of the dance band's performance location halfway between Crematorium 1 and the Hus Villa. The smoke from the crematorium really irritated my colleagues, but it's not irritating, it was just hard to deal with. It was polluting the air, and it was hard to see the notes. Adam Kopyczynski. Because of the wide publicity we received, I was also occasionally contacted by people whose fathers had played in the Auschwitz I orchestra. A particularly tragic story was related to me by Josef van der Star. He was an infant when his father, Abraham van der Star, was arrested on March 24, 1944, and sent to Auschwitz in September 1944 on the same transport as Anne Frank. Abraham had been the first violist of the Philadelphia Orchestra under Leopold Stokowski until he was laid off in 1929, along with the other foreign members of the orchestra. He eventually returned to his native Holland and became a violist in the Utrecht City Orchestra. Stokowski telegrammed him in 1932 that all was arranged and he should return to Philadelphia. His son recounted, "My father was a very honest man, and he had the opinion you cannot break a contract, so he stayed in the Netherlands." After arriving in Auschwitz I, he became a member of the men's orchestra and worked in the Kommando Kartoffelschälerei, or potato peeling commando. In a document dated 21st November 1944 and stamped 22nd November 1944, Abraham van der Star is listed among the Jewish prisoners at Auschwitz with his name spelled Vandstar and his prisoner number specified. Jewish prisoners were not admitted into the Auschwitz I Men's Orchestra until November 1944, when all the original Polish political prisoners were sent to other concentration camps. After surviving a death march in January 1945, Abraham van der Star was murdered on February 2nd, 1945, 2 days after arriving in Dachau. And you can see his name highlighted there, and you see you there at the top. So they're separating out the Jewish prisoners in this list of the men's orchestra in 1944. Film producers who, like me, wanted to as much authenticity as possible in diegetic performances in their films also made contact. "You can't get any more authentic than this," I reassured them. But they were also concerned with the visual effect of the musicians, meaning the number of musicians present on screen and even the instruments themselves. Barry Levinson's film, The Survivor, depicts the life of boxer Harry Haft, who was forced to fight fellow prisoners in death matches in Auschwitz. In this surreal scene, a small ensemble is standing at attention in front of Nazi banners playing "The Most Beautiful Time of Life" for entertainment during Haft's climactic boxing match with a French champion. Hans Zimmer, who composed the soundtrack, accentuates the precisely timed nature of the match with a ticking sound that derives from the tempo of the foxtrot. But also, he emphasizes the suffering and exhaustion of the boxers with groaning electronic sounds. Here is a short excerpt. This is a very violent scene. The sound is not great, but you will be able to see the action. You'll hear little bits of this ensemble playing the most beautiful time of life. And again, they're stationed in front of these Nazi banners.
This is your stage.
He's having flashbacks, and the black and white are his flashbacks.
I don't like that man. And once he leapt onto the real opponent, she said, he's a very good fighter. For the war, he fought for the French heavyweight championships, they said. Jewish.
I'm here to see fight fairly. We will use a bell to start and stop the rounds. Now go back to your corner and wait for the bell.
That's good. I have a lot of money bet on you.
Enough with the glamour shots, Rita Hayworth. Come on, get in here.
Glazier's film, The Zone of Interest, contrasts the idyllic life inside Commandant Höss's villa with the horrific sounds of the adjacent Auschwitz I. It features the recording of another of our pieces, Chinesische Straßenserenade, or Chinese Street Serenade, playing softly in the background during a Sunday concert for prisoners and infiltrating a Sunday party taking place at a very different setting of the Höss villa. So here is the Höss villa and their party. Here's kind of what they're overhearing. Here is a short excerpt of our ensemble playing the opening of this piece. You'll notice that our vocalists are playing the role of the ex-prisoner arrangers, observing the orchestra and speaking lines of testimony.
Originally, there were 7 of us. We had a violin, a bass, an accordion, a trumpet, and a saxophone. We played for the first time on the Feast of the Epiphany, 1941.
final part of my talk, I'd like to consider how these pieces could be used pedagogically to inform audience members and the students who often perform them about the Holocaust. When I began research 8 years ago, my goal was simply to make a recording of a single piece and give it a voice after being silent for so many years. That goal has transformed to thinking about how to make these scores accessible to college music departments or other youth ensembles to perform. After a delay of 4 years still playing Russian roulette with COVID, our ensemble from U of M of 22 students, accompanied by 3 faculty members, was finally able to play concerts in Vienna and Krakow. As part of our experience, the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum conducted a tour that focused on the musicians and ensembles that played there. By this time, our students were very familiar with the testimony lines of the prisoners, and I can't emphasize enough what a dramatic experience it was for them to see the actual location where the prisoners played, the oak tree where the ensemble played marches in the morning and evening, the remnants of the stage halfway between Crematorium 1 and Husse's Villa, where the dance band performed. And this is an overhead of Auschwitz 1. You see those 3 squares. The first one is Crematorium 1. The second one is where the dance band performed. And the third one to the right is the Huss Villa, just to give you kind of a graphic view of that. And this is our ensemble standing in front of the remnants of the stage. In addition, we viewed the manuscripts of some of the pieces we performed, and even some of the instruments used by musicians in Auschwitz. Our trombonist commented, "The camp's trombonist had an incredible story. He was a non-musician who told the Nazis that he played trombone and got transferred from hard labor to the orchestra, ultimately saving his life. Seeing his tarnished and dented horn, knowing that it kept this man from facing the same fate as most of his fellow prisoners, was an extremely powerful experience." Our last concert in Krakow was completely transformed by our experience at the memorial. I am encouraged by the fact that other ensembles played our music during International Holocaust Remembrance Day, including a performance at Wigmore Hall honoring Anita Lasker-Wolfisch, the last member of the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, using students from the Royal Conservatory of Music, or the Dachau Youth Orchestra, which performed at both Auschwitz and the Dachau memorials. I was very moved to learn that this latter orchestra, composed predominantly of German high school students, had chosen the Auschwitz bird, I'm wearing this, from the manuscript, The Most Beautiful Time of Life, to appear on the pen that all orchestra members would wear during their memorial performance. There's Anita Lasker-Wolfisch, and there's we call it the forte bird because its back is formed by a forte symbol. Music has a special ability to inform. As one musician who appeared in the PBS NewsHour stated, "You feel music before you start to think about it." The Auschwitz copyists are no longer living, but I hope they would have enjoyed the applause and utter enjoyment of audiences for their remarkable creative efforts. Thank you. And please, this is usually my favorite talk, or my favorite part of these talks is answer questions. And I'm happy to discuss anything you'd like or answer any questions.
Oh, there are a couple of mics I think you're supposed to use.
Okay.
So the live stream people can hear your questions.
Yep.
If anyone wants to ask a question.
while you were looking through the archives and selecting those 10 numbers, what amount or what kind of other pieces did you find?
Yeah, of course there's a lot of printed music because they did have a symphony orchestra, so you see all of that published music. But in terms of other manuscripts, they were all, for some reason, for the dance band. And I do know from the record there that those manuscripts were returned to the memorial in 1975. If someone hadn't taken the time that had kept these manuscripts and returned them in 1975, we wouldn't even have those. But these hundreds of pages, all in the same kind of format here, were all for the dance band. Many in very incomplete forms, and I very much tended to choose pieces that I felt confident that I could reconstruct.
Other questions?
Do you know where the instruments that were used by the orchestra and by the dance band, do you know where they came from? Were they personal or were they?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you very much for asking that. So they came from various sources. Initially, some of the first 7 members would write home and ask their wife, please send me my violin, and they would send it to the camp. That's one way. The Nazis confiscated instruments in the town of Auschwitz, where the camp was. That's one source. And then when all these deportations, thousands of people started going, these musicians and very successful established musicians brought their instruments with them. So pretty soon they had this enormous warehouse of every kind of instrument imaginable, from people bringing their instrument with them.
I have a question while people are thinking of questions. This is, you mentioned at the beginning that in your first days at the memorial, you had to take time to process. And I'm wondering, as somebody who also does research on the Holocaust, we've talked about this in my class, how do you take care of yourself in doing this very fascinating but incredibly painful personal work?
I've discussed that with another researcher, and we both came to the same conclusion. One of my students came up to me and they said, does it get better, the more you work there? And I said, no, it gets worse. You get more and more sensitized, and you learn, more and more awful things you weren't aware of. And so for me, it's a balance. On the one hand, I very much want to accomplish my goal and realize these pieces, but it's extremely challenging for me, and sometimes I just have to, put the blinders on and just focus on what's sitting in front of me, to deal with it. But it's very hard, I think, for most researchers.
Any other questions before we thank our speaker again? Oh.
When you were conducting your research, did you find more vocal or instrumental scores?
I found the combined, where there would be the instrumental ensemble with that kind of instrumentation there, but in some of them, they would include a male quartet. So it wasn't just the male quartet by itself, it was always in the midst of one of these pieces. And they would perform this like you would see if you watch dance band music from this period, where the ensemble plays and then the singers step up to the mic in the middle of it and sing. So it was combined.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was another question, but...
I was curious if in your research you encountered or got any sense of sort of the survival rates for people who are musicians versus like a typical prisoner, because I know you had mentioned obviously they were getting out of hard labor in certain cases, but then there was also just random shootings while they were playing or things like that. So I was just curious about that.
Yeah, so in general, so for Polish political prisoners, the death rate was about 50%. That's what they've calculated. And then, of course, they had typhus epidemics where a lot of people were dying. And then they had this, again, very sadistic SS officer who seemed to enjoy shooting people. So, yeah, I don't have exact statistics, but I've read numerous testimonies where they complain about the fact that so many of the band members are getting shot. And when you think of it like 50, I mean, that's a lot right there. That's a lot of men, yeah. Yeah, nonetheless, their odds were better than if they were out there doing, you know, very, very heavy labor, yeah.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Thank you. I think about how central music is to the culture of the German-speaking people, and not just them, but Eastern Europeans, Europeans. And I mean, one thing your talk really shows is how deeply embedded the love and skill of music and education of music was for all people of all different backgrounds, right? But I wonder how I can't really formulate the question, but I wonder, do you think about that sometimes, and how do you make sense of it?
Right. Yeah, I know. There's this whole, I can't really make sense of it. I mean, I can kind of imagine, you know, on some level, this picnic. I mean, these were like beer parties, basically, that were happening on Sundays, and they describe them in a lot of detail in other testimonies where they've got roast chicken and a little bit like the film we viewed, and that they wanted music to dance. Okay, you know, you could make a certain logic out of that, as horrible as it was, but it's, I don't know, it's like the title of Shimon Lach's book. He says, "Music of another world." You know, that's what it is. It's just this whole other reality, and sometimes I can't really make sense of it. I give up trying to make sense of it logically.
Am I missing?
Oh, it looks
Am I
like
missing?
one. No? Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm good at this part.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying your questions, by the way, and it helps kind of fill out some of the details. Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any information about the fate of the instruments that were used in the ensemble.
Right. There are some. There's a total of 4, including a tuba, that is still at the memorial. And things were so chaotic at the end with the death marches and so on. And occasionally musicians took their instrument with them, like if they were going on a train or something like that. But like I said, there's only four now, and I'm not sure why that is, if they were destroyed, if they were stolen, you know, what happened to them.
Unless I'm missing somebody, I think this was really fascinating, and I would like to thank you again. And for the students in my classes, Dr. Hall will be joining us tomorrow, so we can go into greater depth, and anybody who wants to join us, you are welcome as well. But thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.